Hello and welcome to the Grief Toolkit, a conversation about building the resources and knowledge to support yourself in approaching and having conversations about death, dying and grief. I'm Julia Samuel and I've written 3 books about grief, informed by my experience as a psychotherapist over the past 3 decades. Grief Works, This Too Shall Pass, and Every Family Has a Story, which has just been published. I'm delighted to be joined by Kathryn Mannix, and we've met each other over the last 2 years, but it has all been virtual. So this is the first time we've met in person, which feels a particular joy. And Kathryn, I'd love you to introduce yourself.
It's such a pleasure to be here with you at last. So I'm a retired palliative care doctor. My passion is to help people to understand the process of ordinary dying, what to expect, how to talk about it, how to help each other to be ready so that when we get to bereavement, we're better prepared. And so I've written a couple of books. My first book is called With the End in Mind, How to Live and Die Well. And my second book is called Listen, How to Find the Words for Tender Conversations.
We're talking about a grief toolkit, so that if anyone watching is needing to have these conversations, or they're facing their own death, or generally kind of in the world knowing that death now is much more present and that it needs to be talked about, we had this idea of a grief toolkit that everybody would make their own, so we can't tell other people what they need. But we have some suggestions. So it's in this is our grief toolkit. It's rather a nice little hamper. And one of our first suggestions is about love and connection, because as human beings, we are wired to connect. And where we love most, we hurt most, and there's most pain. But also around death, there's the greatest fear. So with the people that are the most important to us, they may be the very people we don't have the most important conversations with. Someone you don't care very much about, you can perfectly well talk about their dying because it doesn't do your head in. So tell me what you think about loving and difficult conversations where it's a significant person in your life.
I think that's really important, that distinction, that we have far more trepidation because we're fearing causing hurt. And so we come across people who try to have the conversation and the rest of the family then says, you really don't need to worry about that. Or it's all right, it's all going to be fine. Or why don't you just have another round of chemotherapy? It's all love, isn't it? It's all about trying to be positive and kind. But actually, if you can't talk about your fears, if you can't get yourself organised for what might lie ahead, then you're stuck in a lonely place. And maybe one of the things we can help families to think about is walking 2 roads. That, yes, we really hope that this person can be well, and for now, they are well enough. And what should we do with this precious time while they are well? And yet also, there's a strong possibility that in the future they will be less well than this, they'll be more dependent than this, they'll have needs that will need to be thought about and planned for. So in the same ways you wouldn't dream of presenting to deliver your baby with no antenatal care and no thinking about, where shall I choose for the birth and who would be my birth partner and who might look after the other children on that occasion and how will I get there? This is just sensible planning. And the earlier we do it, I guess, the less anxious we'll feel about it because we are more anxious the more sick a person becomes.
That's lovely, that idea of a parallel path where you want to have hope that you can have valuable, precious time to create valuable, very important memories, which are the things you go back to and live off after the person has died. So that's very precious. But also face the painful reality that they have a life-limiting or a life-threatening illness, or they're very likely to die even very soon. And that when you don't walk down that path, then there's more opportunity for regrets. And one of the things I was thinking as you were talking, and you said really, but maybe I'm going to say it again, but in a different way, is that I think part of the difficulty is that with the people that we love, we sort of believe if I really love them, I have to show them that I love them. And that means that I have hope that they are going to live. And that somehow, if I let them know that we both know they're going to die, I'm not having hope, and in some way I'm failing them, and in some way I am again hastening their death.
It's interesting, that magical thinking, isn't it? Because, you know, talking about sex doesn't make you pregnant. And if talking about winning the lottery made a difference, we'd be a nation of millionaires, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
But we're so frightened about the dying conversation. And in fact, sometimes I talk to patients and families in exactly those terms, because sometimes it's humour that actually helps us to ride over that scary hump into the new place of being able to talk about something. Hope, though, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we can hope for different things.
Yes, the hope that someone will live and the hope that someone may have a peaceful and a good death. I was thinking for our toolkit, maybe we should take a daffodil as a symbol of hope, that hope has two sides to it, and that, of course, the people that are most significant to us, we hope that they will live as long as possible. And the other side of hope, which is the more painful, in some ways complicated hope, that we know that reality, that people are going to die, but we hope that they have a loving and peaceful and painless death that we can remember without distress.
Indeed, and that they, dying people, have hopes for us in surviving, in making sense, in grieving, and yet still finding joy in our lives afterwards. And many, many of my patients have talked about the sense that they have of helping their families to prepare so that they are able to enter their bereavement better prepared and with less regret.
That's so beautiful. And you're right. I've had many clients talk to me and repeat back the words that the person that was dying has said to them, and they then become talismans of calm, if you like, and can give them a way to kind of go forward in their lives where they internalize the person that's died through the words and the memories and the conversations, and that holds them. And so that's hope in the Grief Toolkit. And that takes me to memory and place and memory. In talking about memory, that takes me to Stephen McGann, who we are now going to hear from. He is the actor and author and star of BBC's Call the Midwife, and one of 4 McGann brothers who are familiar faces on our screens and stages. Stephen's father died in 1984 when Stephen was only 21. He tells us what is in his Grief Toolkit.
My name is Stephen McGann, and my story really concerns my dad, Joe, and a very special day that he took me out to when I was about 7 years old. I grew up in Liverpool. There were 5 kids. My dad used to work long, hard shifts, and to get any time with my dad was really precious. One day, my dad said, "What do you want to do today, son? I've got a few hours off. Do you want to go out somewhere?" And I said, "I've never seen an aeroplane going off and landing before, and I'd love to go to the airport." He said, "What a great idea." And we went out together by bus to the airport. The only time I'd ever seen this airport before, being a Beatles fan, was watching those old movie shots of the Beatles coming in back into Liverpool. I remember saying to my dad, "Will we fly away one day? You know, will we ever fly?" It did seem such a dream then, and certainly as my dad didn't even have a car. Later on, it was to have a poignancy because the first time I actually did fly in the end. The first time I came off an aeroplane was that same airport. I was 21 years old and I walked out across that tarmac. It was to rush to see my dad who was dying. I got to know my father better in those last few days of his life than I'd ever known him before. He spoke to me with the knowledge that he may not speak to me anymore. As he approached the end, it was sort of like, it's like a tide going out, and we knew it was finally time. It was August, so it was very sunny, and I cycled fast through the streets. I can remember blazing sunshine, everybody else continuing with their normal life, and that incredible displacement of grief where everything is heightened by your grief. You stop at the lights, you look at people in buses and think, oh, that's an ordinary day. That's someone just having an ordinary time. Everyone will have these days, and sometimes you'll be the person on the bus, and someone will be on that metaphorical bicycle having that heightened, extraordinary, terrible, strange, painful, moving day. That's what I immediately remember after losing him. To look in the mirror, see his face looking back at me, grinning back through the features of my face, is to still see him alive, but to recognize that his loss has helped to form me. Because your grief will also help to take you to somewhere better. It will help to mature you in a way you don't recognize yet. It's a jewel, and even though it might be one that you don't want to take in your hands, it's still a very, very valuable jewel to have.
That was incredibly moving. It felt like Stephen McGann's father was with him. What came up for you when you were watching that?
Isn't it interesting how a place wraps all of those memories up inside it? And also that going back, you see the place as it is now, but it's almost like time travel, that it transports you back to not just how it looked, but how it felt, how it was when he was there with his dad.
So, Kathryn, we have a comment here from James, who lives in Liverpool, who says that he feels guilty about the circumstances of the death of dying from COVID, because a lot of people don't believe that it was the real reason that the person died. I don't know, I mean, it's hard to believe that, but I don't know what your first response to that is.
Gosh, I'm a bit flabbergasted, to be honest. I know that there's been a lot of dispute about to what extent COVID has played a part in somebody dying, often in hospital, who's been very sick with something else and also has had COVID. And I think that's partly about people not really understanding how accurate we have to be when we write death certificates. So you can't write COVID on a death certificate unless it's played a part in the person becoming sick enough to die. But it hadn't occurred to me that that might make people who are grieving a person who's died from COVID feel, well, he says guilty, but actually it's almost as though he's afraid or ashamed to say that it was COVID in case people denigrate that. Isn't it? That's really surprising and how difficult.
So difficult, and makes what's already incredibly painful and difficult so much worse. And as you say, he described it as guilt, and it does feel like guilt, but the underpinning of guilt is shame, which in some way other people's response to him has delegitimized his grief, that somehow in their judgment of the circumstances of the death, that he doesn't have a right to grieve. And that to me links to many, circumstances of the death have a big impact to play in grieving. And it can be, again, those related to a sense of shame, which could be from a death from a drugs overdose, it could be death from suicide, it could be death from driving your car kind of under the influence of alcohol, and all of those, somehow other people have an opinion, and that kind of interrupts your very natural, what should be very natural, kind of grief around the person that's died, which in some way detracts from your need to grieve fully for the person that has died.
That's really important, isn't it? That there are certain deaths that somehow society judges as more worthy, more tragic, more sympathisable with, and others that are not. And how very difficult for people who feel that their right to grieve is being removed by other people's opinion.
And just to add into that, that our outcome when we are bereaved is completely connected to the love and connection that we receive from others. When we are hurting, the single thing that matters most is that we feel love and connection to other people. And if we feel that they're judging the circumstances of the death, that kind of, in your frame of listening and being heard and being fully kind of known, that is a massive blocker to that. So thinking about our grief toolkit, and particularly the first aid kit, our own unique kind of first aid kit, when you've been bereaved, and as you said, you have been touched by grief during COVID, what is one of the things that are in your grief toolkit that helps you?
One of the things that I found particularly helpful is photographs. And I have photographs of my very dear friends who would have been my great advisors in different spheres of my life, both of whom now have been dead for many years. But sometimes when I'm in a conundrum, I will talk to their photographs, and I can imagine the kind of advice that they would have given. And then I can go and think about why I'm not applying that advice.
That's a lovely symbol, isn't it, the photograph? Because the people that we love, we hold them inside us. And we, you know, whether it's our parent or our grandparent or our friend, and we can look at a photo and then turn inwards and ask them, what do they think? What is their advice? And we'll hear it. And you know, you were saying sometimes I think, why don't I listen to it? And where I went with that is that we can get stuck in our bodies, and we can get kind of locked in our bodies, and often moving, kind of going, remembering, taking the photograph in your pocket, walking, going out into nature or in your park, wherever it is, that can shift stuck feelings.
Really important, and something that I remember from very early on. One of the very first patients I met in a hospice, and I was asking her when she was first told that she had incurable cancer, a young mum.
Oh.
What was the thing that she did that helped her to cope? And she said she wanted to go to this particular lake in Northumberland and just walk around the lake and be out in nature, because that was something they did as a family, but it was a beautiful place, and that just going there lifted her spirits. Nothing else was different. The truth was still the truth. But that connection to nature, that moving in nature, was so buoying for her.
And we know from research that moving and being in nature is curative and profoundly healing. And earlier this week, we spoke to TV presenter and Blue Peter legend, Janet Ellis. And Janet's husband of 35 years, John Leach, died from lung cancer in 2020. And here Janet tells us the things that she has found helpful since John died.
My name is Janet Ellis, and I'm talking about my husband, John Leach, who died in July 2020. We met when I was still doing Blue Peter, and I liked John straight away, so much so that I asked him out, and that was in 1987. He really made me laugh all the time. And he was completely himself. I never saw John adapt to fit a situation. He was immensely kind and true, and also very, very sexy man. There was no subject we didn't talk about. So when he was diagnosed with cancer, we didn't have to change our way of being with each other. We just carried on the conversations. Everybody around us was positive, right up until 2 days before he died. But I sensed the change, and I stood next to him and knew that he was dying, and said thank you. I certainly wasn't going to say goodbye. He left this letter, this speech, and it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. Janet, I think I've been the luckiest man alive. Great kids that I love, a job with the same colleagues, now good friends, always looking out for each other, but most of all having a companion and lover like Janet. Our best times were always when we were alone. Nothing touched us. We lived and laughed and loved until the wheels fell off. I'm sorry we can't have all the days we promised ourselves, darling. Thank you for all the ones we had. And didn't they pass at lightning speed? If anybody at any point had said to me, describe your biggest fear, it would be him dying. It would be. But I can still do things. I can still take pleasure. I can still make plans. I can still work, thank goodness. I can still look forward to things in a way that I did. So I think this is my best, worst life. Reflection can be as deep, as continuing as you like. It can also be just a moment when you think about somebody you've lost. Just bring them back, bring them into your world. He's completely here. I mean, apparently, apart from his colossal absence, weirdly, don't get rid of him that easy.
So Janet has kind of echoed what I said about how walking shifts your emotions, but also connects you to memories, its place, like walking there with John and now walking in the presence of his absence, but she can feel like he's accompanying her as she's walking around those familiar places.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? And because it's so familiar to her with him, she'll be familiar all through the different turnings of the seasons.
Yeah.
And it's just going to feel like a safe place. That thing of being able to continue the bonds with the person who isn't here is so important, and that's a really beautiful way of doing it, isn't it?
And continuing the bonds, that the love never dies, and, as you said, importantly, a safe place, because often grief feels like fear, fury, kind of like the alarm system in your brain is going off. And if you find your particular familiar pathway in your grief toolkit that you know calms you, so that we, as human beings, we are habit-forming beings, and we associate feelings with particular habits and times of day and places. So like Janet associates walking those familiar pathways with a sense of calm, and she may feel sad and she may cry, but for her, they are a safe place to grieve. And the bit I would add in, not for Janet, because this is her particular way, is that for families who find it very difficult to talk with each other about their grief, walking and talking is incredibly cathartic and healing. That thing of being in rhythm together, side by side. You don't have to speak. You're not eyeballing each other. You're not saying, what are you feeling? It's a bit like being with someone in the back of the car where you can be silent and meditative, and then someone can say, oh, I really remember, or I feel really sad about. And people can either respond or not respond. But it's a very kind of cathartic, open way of continuing bonds, but reconfiguring in this new calibration of a family which is without the person that's died. So now we have a question from Alicia in Glasgow. And what she's asking is, I want to help my friend whose dad has recently died, and she doesn't know how to be of use to her or what to do. What would you pop into Alicia's grief toolkit?
Oh, this is that thing, isn't it, of being overwhelmed by the sense of wanting to help and frightened to take the first step.
Yeah.
So I would put an invitation card into the toolkit so that Alicia can let her friend know that she's really, really sorry to hear that her dad has died.
So acknowledging it.
So I'm not pretending it hasn't happened. And you must have lots of things on your mind, but if you want to talk, if you want somebody to sit with you while you cry, if you need help with the school run, or
Practical
some
things.
shopping, or depends how close by they are, of course. But that thing of saying, I'm here for you, it's an invitation, and I leave it with you. Bereaved people tell us, don't they, that people who say, I'm here if you need me, if you need anything,
Text
just
me.
say. And grief is so overwhelming, you don't know what you want, you don't know what you need. So actually offers of help, very concrete offers, can be really helpful, can't they? Like the shopping or the school run, putting the bins out, mowing the lawn, those sorts of things. But opening the door, invitation card that says, I'm in your team, and keep saying every now and again, still happy to talk if you like. Don't expect answers to the texts. People are full of stuff in their heads, but just walking alongside.
That's a lovely way of saying it, to walking alongside, that you, in acknowledging it, you can't fix it. You can't make this better. But you can show up in the offer by the invitation. And that means over the long haul. So different people will have different levels of connection and friendship. But if you're a really good friend, that you kind of keep going, you don't just kind of give up after the first 3 months. And I think that's one of the difficulties, that often a lot of people turn up and bring food or even offers of help, offer, post-COVID to go for walks with you. But after 3 months, it's like, I need to go back to my life and I have other things that are on my mind. And so if Alicia really is close to this friend or other people listening, it's that you need, grief, you don't get over grief. You find a way of living with it and coming to terms with it. But it's not like suddenly one day you're fine and the next day, it's not suddenly one day you're not fine and then the next day you're fine. It's an ongoing, It's an ongoing adjustment.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing adjustment to this new reality that no one wanted and didn't wish for.
Yeah.
And so for a good friend, you need to be, as you said, beautifully beside them for the long haul.
And the thing about your dear friends is they'll know significant things, won't they? They will notice when there's something going on in the news that might be a trigger for you because it's something to do with the person who died that they're aware of. They will know perhaps the dates of your important anniversaries and celebrations, the birthday of the person who died, those particular dates where you might be wobbly. Of course, you can be very wobbly on any old day, can't you?
Yeah.
But just somebody to remember that today might particularly be tricky for you is really important, that sense of companionship and all the firsts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to add a bit of complexity, is that sometimes your closest friends find it too difficult for their own reasons. They may be bereaved themselves, they may not have an emotional language or understanding. And so some friendships break on bereavement, and other sometimes new friendships of someone you didn't know, that person shows up who really is the kind of friend that you really need. And as much as you're saying that you don't know what you want often, a bit further down the line, I would encourage people who are bereaved to put in their Grief Toolkit maybe a weight or a muscle, to build a muscle of letting them know what their needs are, build a muscle of the assertion to be able to name their needs, and to build a muscle of the assertion to tell people what they need. Because as often their friends or family will say, I'm not a mind reader.
Yeah.
And often when we're grieving, we're so confused, we don't know our own mind. But actually, if we do something like journaling, which we can also pop in the Grief Toolkit, we can begin to know what is going on, and that can clarify for us what we need and then what we can ask for. Because people want to be able to help, they want to be a good friend, but often they're too frightened and don't know how.
Yeah. So perhaps also for bereaved people who feel that their connections are becoming lost, maybe it's very brave, but maybe to be able to text or call or send a little postcard that says, I'm missing you.
Yeah.
Come and have a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Because that invitation works
Goes
both ways.
That's lovely. So I was thinking about what you were saying about continuing bonds, how the love for the person never dies, and our collaborative frame about touchstones to memory, that we can connect to the person through memory. And Chris Kamara, who will be known to many of you, played 650 games for clubs, including Leeds United, Middlesbrough, and Sheffield United, before hanging up his boots for a successful career in the commentator's box. In 2003, Chris's beloved mum, Irene, died from breast cancer. Here he shares his best advice for those who are supporting someone who is grieving.
My name's Cami Chris Kamara, and this is about my beautiful mum, Irene Kamara. She was a fabulous mum. She was everything to me. There's me as a baby. That's a face only a mother could love. I grew up in Middlesbrough. We were the first black family on that estate, so life was difficult, very difficult. I can always remember kicking the ball around in the playground, knowing that I wanted to be a footballer. Borough boys came to see my head teacher and said we'd like to have him at Middlesbrough boys. I told my dad and he wouldn't have it, not in any way, shape or form. He marched me down to the recruiting office and made me sign on the Navy. I got drafted into the naval football team, and my big break was we played against Portsmouth and I scored a couple of goals and they offered to buy me out. So Portsmouth paid £200 to the Navy. It still goes down as the worst deal in the club's history. When I left the Navy, I had to ask Mum to speak to my dad to calm him down. She always protected me. All my mum ever wanted was for me to be happy. I was working for Sky. I'd spoken to my mum and we knew she was close to not being with us anymore. And I said, don't worry, after this show on Sunday, I'll be home. Anyway, the producer went, oh, do me a favour. Would you go to QPR on the bank holiday Monday? I said, oh, I've got to go to Borough. He went, no, don't worry about it then. And I went, no, it's fine. So I phoned Mum, and she went, oh dear. And I went, what do you mean, oh dear? And she went, no, it's fine. And I went home that night after the QPR game, and 7 o'clock the next morning, I got the call. She'd gone. I wasn't there. I beat myself up so much. I wouldn't want anyone to feel like I do, you know. So it's good to talk. It's good to tell other people. I'm just beginning to find that out. The problem shared is a problem cared. I now believe that's so important.
It was lovely hearing Chris talk about his mother and his hometown. And I was thinking about what you were saying about two paths for conversations when you're facing death. But also, I think there are two paths in memory of the person who has died. And there is the living story of the person that died, Chris's mother, and the lovely way that he described her and the places they were in together and his hometown, and the dying story. And what we need for a kind of grief that we can find a way of living with and accommodate, grow with, is both stories with their equal pathway that live side by side.
Yeah, so when you're talking about that, it's reminding me of being at work, working alongside families who are accompanying somebody during their dying, in the days when visiting was allowed or we were visiting people at home. And we see families often making rotas, taking it in turns to be there. And as the new shift comes in and the old shift goes off to catch up on their sleep and have a shower, have a meal, they do a handover of the last thing Dad said or the last thing that Mum ate, or
Lovely.
you know how they've been so far. And then the new shift takes that story and then they add any things that happened in their shift to the next shift. And what we're watching is the family building the story of the last days.
Of the dying.
And they will tell that story over and over, and different people will add their contributions, and it will become folklore in the family and a huge comfort as each person weaves their little strand into that family story of the dying. It's really, really important.
So, Kathryn, we have another question, and it's from Amber, who had a member of her family who died from COVID. And she says, I feel like I never mourned the loss of my relation during the pandemic. Surreal, like we've been talking about. And I'm wondering if I never will now. I feel like the time for a family event has passed, but I'd really like to arrange something.
That's really tough, isn't it? And there will be people like that throughout our nations in exactly that situation. No funeral at all, or a maximum of 10 people at a funeral, and families left with all these unfinished pieces of business and mourning. So one of the things that's in our toolkit, I think, is about remembering, and it's a candle. And I think the thing that's important is not so much the timing, it's about the need to finish the business, and that to create some kind of ceremony, whether that's something very formal and linked to the kind of family values and maybe faith values that a family has, or whether it's a massive family picnic, or you just go and build the biggest sandcastle, or whatever it is, a gathering that celebrates and commemorates and mourns is a really important thing. And traditionally we do it very, very close to the death. But whenever we do it, as you've said so powerfully, we bring the person with us in our hearts, in our minds, in those bonds, and we mourn together, look after each other. Now, I feel a little bit embarrassed that I'm speaking about mourning and grieving to an expert on that area. So what are your thoughts?
I've got nothing to add. I would just underline exactly what you said, is that it's never too late, Amber, and anyone who's listening, to remember and mourn and gather together the people who this person was significant to, and as you say, to remember, to celebrate and to grieve. And in a way, that is what the National Day of Reflection also offers us. It offers us this very special, significant day to come together when we feel so isolated and disconnected, but come together in humanity, in our different nations, from all of our differences, and to bridge those differences, that we can connect and remember and mourn and celebrate the people we love on a National Day of Reflection. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. My huge thanks to Dr. Kathryn Mannix and to all of our contributors for sharing their stories: Stephen McGann, Chris Kamara and Janet Ellis. This has been part of a series of online talks for the National Day of Reflection. Today is a day for us to connect with each other as we support the millions of people who are grieving and reflect on the lives of the people who've died. Thank you for joining us. I really hope you found this conversation helpful.